I stood outside in the pouring rain, watching the front door of my own house slam shut. Then I heard the loud click of the lock. Through the window, my mother-in-law smiled, holding my 6-year-old son's birthday gifts, while my husband turned his back on our crying boy. They really thought they had broken me. They thought I was alone now, completely poor with nowhere to go. But as I pulled out my phone with a shaking hand to call a number I hadn't dialed in 8 years, everything changed. My one call set a massive plan into motion. The very next day, a shiny black SUV stopped right at their front door. The family watched from the window, trembling as a powerful man stepped out. That man was my billionaire father, and he wasn't there to talk. He was there to take back everything. Before we dive into how I ruined their lives, tell me in the comments, which city are you watching this video from? My name is Natalie Vance. For most of my life, people only saw me for my last name. My father, Arthur Vance, built a massive shipping and real estate empire from the ground up. Growing up, I had everything money could buy: private schools, luxury vacations, and a massive trust fund waiting for me. But all I ever wanted was a simple, normal life. I wanted someone to love me for who I am, not for my father's bank account. That was my biggest mistake. I was young, naive, and completely blind to how cruel the world could be. When I met Mark Miller, I thought I had found my perfect escape. He was a struggling architectural consultant. He didn't drive a luxury car, he didn't wear expensive suits, and he seemed so genuinely humble. When we started dating, he would take me to small, quiet coffee shops and spend hours listening to me talk. He told me he loved how down-to-earth I was. He made me feel safe. He made me feel real. But when Mark proposed to me, the dream shattered. I took him to meet my father at our family estate. My father is a brilliant businessman who can read people in a single second. After a tense dinner, my father pulled me into his private study. He looked me dead in the eye and said, "Natalie, that man is a parasite. He and his mother are greedy, and they only smell blood in the water. If you marry him, you are making the biggest mistake of your life." I was furious. I yelled at my father, accusing him of being cynical and controlling. I told him he couldn't see past money. My father gave me an ultimatum. If you walk out that door with him, I will cut you off completely. You will not receive a single dime from the Vance estate. In my mind, I was proving my love. I thought, I will show my father that our love is stronger than his money. So, I walked out. Mark and I got married in a cold, empty courthouse. No family, no big reception, just us. True to his word, my father stopped calling. He cut all contact. I was officially on my own. For the first 2 years, things were okay. We lived in a small, rented suburban house. Mark worked hard, and I used my own savings to help him. I had an independent inheritance of $80,000 left to me by my grandmother. Mark told me he was drowning in $45,000 of credit card debt from his college days. Because I loved him and wanted our marriage to succeed, I paid off every single cent of his debt without hesitating. But then, I got pregnant with our son, Toby. And that is exactly when the nightmare started. Mark's mother, Evelyn, decided she needed to move into our house to help with the baby. The moment she stepped through our front door, the atmosphere in our home changed completely. Evelyn didn't come to help, she came to rule. She was a loud, bitter woman who constantly made passive-aggressive comments about everything I did. If I cooked dinner, it wasn't good enough. If I cleaned, the house was still dirty. Worse than that, Evelyn began to drain our finances. Mark started making more money at his firm, but I never saw any of it. Evelyn convinced Mark that his sister Chloe needed financial help. Chloe wanted to open an elite art boutique, so Mark began pouring thousands of dollars into his sister's failed business ideas. When I complained, Evelyn would look at me with disgust and say, "You don't understand family values, Natalie. You are just a spoiled girl who expects everything handed to her." I had to sacrifice my own career to stay home and raise Toby. To keep our household afloat and buy basic necessities, I started working late-night freelance design gigs while the whole house slept. I was exhausted, sleeping only 3 hours a night. Yet Evelyn treated me like a useless burden. The dynamic became toxic. Evelyn openly favored Chloe and Chloe's spoiled son, Mason. During family dinners, Evelyn would buy expensive toys and clothes for Mason using Mark's salary, while my son Toby wore cheap, faded hand-me-downs. When Toby would ask why his cousin got a new toy and he didn't, my heart would break into a million pieces. I turned to Mark for support, begging him to talk to his mother, but Evelyn had already spent months whispering in his ear. She convinced him that I was lazy, that I was trying to isolate him from his family, and that I still thought I was too good for them because of my wealthy past. Slowly, Mark stopped defending me. He started taking his mother's side on every single argument. Eventually, he completely controlled the bank accounts. If I needed money just to buy groceries or milk for Toby, I had to ask Mark for permission and show him the receipt for every single penny. I was trapped in a prison of my own making, completely cut off from the father who had warned me this would happen. I was too proud to admit I was wrong, so I just kept taking the abuse, hoping that if I gave more, worked harder, and stayed silent, things would change. But they didn't change. They just got worse. The absolute breaking point happened on a hot Saturday afternoon, right during Toby's 6th birthday party. For months, Toby had been begging for a simple astronaut-themed birthday party. He loved space, and he wanted a special space cake more than anything. Because Mark refused to give me extra money from our joint account, calling it a waste of funds, I had to work double shifts for my freelance clients. I stayed up until 4 in the morning for 3 weeks straight, just to earn the extra $90 to buy that custom cake and a small toy rocket ship. When the day arrived, I decorated our small backyard as best as I could. Toby was beaming, wearing a cheap plastic astronaut helmet, looking happier than I had seen him in years. But the mood shattered the moment Evelyn walked through the gate, flanked by Chloe and her son Mason. Evelyn didn't even look at Toby. Instead, she walked right over to the food table, inspected the cake I had worked so hard to buy, and turned up her nose. "You spent money on this nonsense?" she whispered loudly enough for the few neighborhood guests to hear. "Mark works himself to the bone while you throw away money on expensive cakes." I swallowed my pride, balled my hands into fists behind my back, and said nothing. I didn't want to ruin my son's day. An hour later, it was time to cut the cake. Toby stood proudly in front of the table, holding the little plastic cake knife. All the neighborhood kids gathered around, ready to sing. But just as we began to sing, Evelyn marched forward, physically shoved Toby out of the way, and grabbed the knife right out of his hand. She handed the knife to her preferred grandson, Mason. "Mason is going to cut the cake today," Evelyn announced with a smug grin. "He got the highest marks in his kindergarten class this week, so he deserves the honor. Toby can just watch." Toby froze, his eyes filled with fat, heavy tears. He looked at the cake, then at his grandmother, and then at me. "But Mommy, it's my birthday," he whispered, his voice cracking. In a panic, he reached out and tightly hugged the cake box, trying to protect the one thing he had waited for all year. "Let go of that box, you selfish little brat!" Evelyn snapped, her face twisting in anger. She tried to pull the cake away from him, but Toby held on, crying loudly now. What happened next made my blood run cold. Evelyn lost her temper completely. On the table sat a large mug of hot black coffee that Chloe had just poured. Evelyn grabbed the mug and threw the liquid directly at Toby's upper chest and arm to make him drop the cake box. Toby screamed in pure terror and pain. Something inside me snapped. I didn't care about being a quiet, submissive wife anymore. I rushed forward, slapped the coffee mug out of Evelyn's hand so hard it shattered against the brick wall, and pushed her away from my son. I immediately grabbed a pitcher of ice water from the table and poured it over Toby's clothes to cool his skin, checking desperately for any damage. Thank goodness the coffee had cooled down slightly from sitting on the table, leaving his skin bright red and irritated, but there was no severe physical harm or blisters, just absolute crushing emotional trauma. Toby was shaking violently, clutching my neck, crying hysterically. "What is wrong with you?" I screamed at Evelyn, my voice shaking with rage. "He is a child. It is his birthday." Evelyn stumbled back, pretending to be deeply offended. She immediately burst into fake tears, clutching her chest. Mark, look at her. Your wife just assaulted me. She pushed me in my own son's house. She is unstable, just like her arrogant family. Mark stepped out of the house, having missed the actual conflict but hearing his mother's dramatic screams. He didn't even look at Toby, who was sobbing and shivering in my arms. He walked straight over to me, his face dark with anger, and shoved me back by my shoulder. "How dare you respect my mother like that?" Mark yelled, his voice echoing across the yard. "You have been bitter and jealous of my family since day one. My mother is right. You think you're better than us because of your past. Mark, look at your son," I screamed, lifting Toby up. "She threw hot coffee at him on his birthday." "She was just trying to teach him a lesson about sharing," Mark shot back, completely brainwashed. "You're raising a spoiled brat. I'm sick of your constant drama, Natalie. Get out." "What?" I whispered, unable to believe my ears. Chloe walked over and tossed my canvas diaper bag and my old purse right into the grass. "You heard him," Chloe said with a nasty smirk. "Get out of our house. Let's see how long your proud attitude lasts when you're sleeping on the street." Mark walked over to the back door, escorted his mother and sister inside, and shut the door. I carried Toby through the side gate to the front of the house, hoping Mark would calm down. But as we reached the front porch, the sky opened up and a heavy downpour of rain began to fall. I tried to turn the front doorknob, but right then I heard the loud, definitive click of the deadbolt. Mark had locked us out in a rainstorm. Through the front window, Evelyn stood holding Toby's unopened birthday gifts like trophies, smiling directly at me. Mark stood right behind her, turning his back on his own crying child. Sitting on the wet concrete step, shielding Toby from the freezing rain with my own body, the crushing grief inside me completely died. In its place, a freezing cold, calculated rage took over. The naive, quiet girl who wanted to be loved for who she was died right there on that porch. I wiped the rainwater from my eyes, opened my purse, and pulled out my phone. My fingers were shaking, but my mind was perfectly clear. I dialed a private number, a number I hadn't permitted myself to touch in 8 long years out of pure pride. The phone rang once, then twice. On the third ring, a deep, familiar voice answered. "Natalie?" my father said, his voice heavy with years of unspoken worry. Hearing his voice almost made me break down, but I forced myself to stay strong. "Dad," I said, my voice dropping into a cold whisper. "You were right. They threw Toby and me out into the rain. I am ready to come home. And Dad, I want them gone." There was a brief pause on the other end of the line. Then, my billionaire father spoke with absolute, terrifying authority. "Stay exactly where you are, sweetheart. I am sending a car to pick you up right now. Tonight, you rest. Tomorrow, we take back everything." The next morning, the rain had cleared, leaving the suburban street quiet and damp. Inside the Miller household, Evelyn, Mark, and Chloe were sitting around the kitchen island, drinking fresh coffee and casually dividing up the birthday gifts I had bought for Toby. They genuinely believed I was sitting in some cheap motel room, crying, broken, and preparing to crawl back on my knees to beg for Mark's forgiveness. They had absolutely no idea that I hadn't slept in a motel. I had spent the night in my old bedroom at the Vance estate, watching my father's top-tier legal and financial teams work through the night under my direct supervision. At exactly 9 in the morning, a massive, shiny black SUV pulled up to the curb directly in front of the Miller house. The engine let out a low, powerful growl as it idled. From the front window, Evelyn paused, a half-opened toy box in her hands, her brow furrowing as she watched the luxury vehicle block their driveway. Mark and Chloe stood up, walking to the window to peer through the blinds. The heavy passenger door opened, and a tall, powerful man in a perfectly tailored dark suit stepped out onto the asphalt. It was my father, Arthur Vance. He didn't look angry, he looked completely calm, which made him look infinitely more dangerous. He walked up the driveway, flanked by 2 corporate lawyers carrying thick, leather-bound folders. Mark opened the front door, his face pale, his voice trembling as he tried to put on a brave face. "Mr. Vance? What are you doing here? If you're here about Natalie, she left last night after a massive tantrum." "Shut your mouth, Mark," my father said, his voice quiet but ringing with absolute authority. He walked right past Mark into the living room, where Evelyn and Chloe were standing, frozen in fear. Before anyone could say another word, I stepped out from the back seat of the SUV. I wasn't wearing my old, faded freelance clothes anymore. I was wearing a sleek, professional designer blazer, my hair perfectly done, and my eyes fixed on the family with a cold, unyielding stare. I walked into the house and stood right next to my father. "Natalie?" Mark stammered, looking between me and my father's legal team. "What is the meaning of this? You can't just bring your father here to intimidate us. This is my house." "Actually, Mark, it isn't," I said, stepping forward. I reached into the folder my father's lead attorney held out and pulled out a stack of stamped legal documents, throwing them onto the coffee table. "For the past 3 weeks, my father's private intelligence firm has been archiving every single financial misstep your family has made," I explained, leaning against the edge of the sofa. "And last night, as the newly appointed chairwoman of Vance Holdings, I systematically bought out every single piece of your life." Mark rushed over to the table, his hands shaking violently as he picked up the papers. Evelyn crowded next to him, her eyes scanning the text as her face slowly turned a sickly shade of white. "As you know," I continued smoothly, "your architectural firm relies entirely on a $2.5 million line of credit from Apex Regional Bank to pay its staff and suppliers. At midnight last night, Vance Holdings finalized the purchase of that bank's parent company. Your credit line has been officially frozen for an internal fraud audit. You cannot pay your employees, Mark. Your business is paralyzed." You can't do that," Mark gasped, looking at me with pure horror. "That's illegal." "It's completely legal, Mark. It's called capitalism," I replied. "But we didn't stop there. Chloe, let's talk about your failed art boutique. To keep it afloat, you took out a massive, high-interest secondary loan using this very house as collateral. You fell behind on the payments months ago. Last night, I personally purchased that toxic debt package from the lender. I am now your direct creditor and your landlord." Chloe let out a strangled cry, clutching her mother's arm. "And finally, Evelyn," I turned my gaze to my mother-in-law, who was trembling so hard she could barely stand. "We tipped off the IRS regarding your unregistered cash-only antique business, the one you've been using to hide Mark's under-the-table corporate bonuses. Your personal bank accounts are officially locked pending a full federal investigation." "Natalie, please!" Evelyn burst into fake tears, dropping her arrogant act instantly. She reached out to grab my hands, but my father stepped in front of her, his massive frame blocking her entirely. "Don't touch my daughter," my father said, his voice dropping into a dangerous whisper. I handed Mark the final document from the pile. "This is an immediate 30-day eviction notice and a full debt foreclosure demand. You have exactly 4 weeks to clear out of this house. Everything you own, everything you thought you stole from me, is gone." Months passed, and the wheel of karma turned with absolute, brutal precision. Without his line of credit, Mark's architectural firm collapsed within weeks, leaving him personally liable for massive corporate debts. Chloe's boutique went into immediate liquidation, and Evelyn's assets were completely seized by the authorities. The proud, arrogant Miller family was completely reduced to ash. One afternoon, I sat behind the massive mahogany desk in my new executive office at the Vance Holdings headquarters. The double doors opened, and my secretary announced that Mark and his family were outside, begging for just 5 minutes of my time. I told her to let them in. When they walked through the doors, they looked like completely different people. They were smaller, thinner, and utterly broken. Mark was wearing a wrinkled, cheap suit, his eyes hollow and desperate. Evelyn looked ancient, her shoulders slumped, her arrogant smirk replaced by a look of pathetic defeat. Chloe stood behind them, holding her son Mason's hand, looking completely terrified. "Natalie," Mark choked out, stepping toward the desk. His voice was trembling. "Please, we are facing total ruin. The lawyers are stripping away everything. We have nowhere to go, no money for food, and no one will hire me with a corporate fraud investigation on my record. You're a good person, Natalie. You always were. You wouldn't let your own family starve on the street." Evelyn practically dropped to her knees, clutching the edge of my desk, weeping openly. "Natalie, my sweet daughter, I was wrong. I went too far, I was stressed, I was foolish, but please, remember the bond we shared. We will move into your guest house, we will clean, we will do whatever it takes. Just save us from the streets. I looked at them from across the desk, feeling a profound, peaceful sense of detachment. The years of tears, the constant humiliation, the cold, rainy night they threw my son out like garbage, all of it had crystallized into absolute clarity. I felt no anger, no hatred, just pure, unadulterated justice. "You're right, Mark," I said, my voice calm, steady, and terrifyingly cold. "I am a good person, and that is exactly why I have already made my decision." A massive wave of relief washed over Mark's face. A glimmer of hope ignited in his eyes, and Evelyn instantly started nodding, wiping her tears with a shaking tissue. "Oh, thank heaven, Natalie. I knew your kind heart would win. Tell us what to do, we'll sign anything." "You misunderstand me," I interrupted, my tone dropping to sub-zero. I slid a sleek leather folder across the polished wood of the desk. "I didn't make a decision to save you. I made a decision about what to do with the mortgages and the deed to your family home." David reached for the papers, his hands shaking violently as he opened the folder. Evelyn crowded next to him, her eyes scanning the legal text. "Deed of transfer and charitable dissolution. All remaining assets, properties, and holdings formerly belonging to the Miller estate are hereby liquidated. In lieu of standard foreclosure, the total value and physical property shall be entirely redirected to the Grace Haven Foundation." "What? What is this?" Mark whispered, his face turning entirely pale, his breath catching in his throat. "I didn't foreclose on the house to put money back into my bank account," I said, leaning forward, locking my eyes onto Evelyn. "Watching you scrounge for pennies while blaming each other for your ruin is far more poetic. I have officially dissolved your family's holdings and transferred ownership of your house to a charitable organization." Evelyn let out a strangled gasp, clutching her chest. "Our house? Our legacy? To a charity? What kind of charity?" "Starting next week, your beloved family home is being turned into a regional shelter for victims of domestic abuse and familial negligence," I announced, each word hitting them like a physical blow. "The very halls where you humiliated me, the very porch where you locked my son out in the freezing rain, will now be a safe haven for vulnerable women and children escaping monsters just like you." "You can't do this!" Chloe screamed from the back. "Where are we supposed to go? We have nothing." "That is no longer my concern," I replied smoothly, closing the master file on my desk. "But to ensure you don't literally freeze on the street, I did exercise one very small, final act of charity. I have paid the security deposit and the first 3 months of rent on a tiny, 2-bedroom, 5th-floor walkout apartment on the absolute outskirts of the industrial district." "A 2-bedroom?" Mark stammered, horrified. "There are 4 of us, my mother, my sister, her son, and me. Then I suggest you and your sister get real jobs." I cut him off, my voice ringing with absolute final authority. "The same sister you favored over your own wife? You can all live together in that cramped, dark space, look at each other every single day, and remind yourselves of exactly how your greed brought you there. You wanted my family's money? Well, now you know exactly what it feels like to be crushed by it." The boardroom fell into a suffocating dead silence. The realization hit them with total devastation. They weren't just poor, they were completely irrelevant. I hadn't acted out of a desire for a messy, dramatic screaming match. I had acted out of pure, calculated justice, erasing their status while using their ruin to build something beautiful for others. The heavy doors opened, and my father walked into the room. He didn't even glance at the trembling, sobbing family standing by the desk. His eyes were only for me, filled with immense, quiet pride. He placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "The car is downstairs, sweetheart," he said softly. "Your mother and Toby are waiting. It's time to go home." I stood up, smoothing down my blazer, and walked right past the ruined family without looking back. As our SUV pulled away into the bright morning sunshine, I looked at Toby sitting next to me, laughing and playing with his toy rocket ship. For years, I thought I had lost everything by ignoring my father's warning. But as my father took my hand from the front seat, I realized I hadn't lost anything at all. I had simply learned the hardest lesson of my life. and I had come out of the fire completely unbreakable.